You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Welcome to the fourth session of the day, which will be an important topic, the debt impasse in Africa, unlocking development potential. So before I will introduce our distinguished panelists, first I will start with Honorable Ambassador Dr. Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry of the African Union. Mr. Muchanga was the Permanent Secretary in the Cabinet Office in charge of Parliamentary Affairs in Zambia. He was also a former ambassador to Ethiopia with extra accreditation to the African Union. He has both at home and abroad dealt with issues broadly related to international economic policy, analysis and implementation, as well as regional integration, policy analysis and implementation. Honorable Ambassador, I will invite you to join the podium. Thank you very much. Another panelist is Jason Rosario Braganza. I hope I'm pronouncing well your name. Jason is an economist with over 10 years experience working on international development in Africa. Over the past decade, Jason has focused his work on trade and finance for development, domestic resources mobilization, as well as poverty and inequality. He also served as the co-head and program director of Tax and International Lawyers Project, ILP. Prior to joining ILP, Jason served as the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Research at Tax Justice Network Africa. I would like to invite you to join the podium. Then we have Mrs. Chenai, Executive Director, Tax Justice Network Africa. She has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years in Asia and Africa and has expertise in international trade and Africa economic governance, with experience in research and coordination policy, advocacy, and leadership development. Prior to her appointment, she served as the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at TGNA, having joined in 2021. I would like you to join the podium. So before... Hello? Yeah. Before starting our conversation, I would like to quickly set the scene. I think today we gathered to confront one of the most pressing issues in Africa, Africa's debt challenge. Africa is a continent of 54 countries with unparalleled beauty, diversity, and resilience. But the continent also is at a crossroad. Africa, the rising debt services in Africa and the financial squeeze is pushing many African countries away from sustainable development. According to African Development Bank, in this year, 2024, African countries will pay 74 billion in debt service compared to 17 billion in 2010, meaning that many resources are being used to pay debt. Many African countries spend more on debt service than education or health, meaning that we are compromising our long-run development. So in 2023, as of November 2023, about 21 African countries were in debt distress or high risk of debt distress. So behind these figures, we have the story of mixed opportunities, missed growth opportunities, and the perpetuation of poverty. So as today we came together not only to acknowledge the gravity of debt issue in Africa, but also chart the path forward. So with my panelists, distinguished panelists, which are already here. Together, we will explore the underlying causes of African debt and the solution to address Africa's debt challenge. The road ahead may be fraught with obstacles, but with courage and collaboration, we can pave a way for a brighter future for Africa. So, without further ado, let us start our conversation. So, my first question here, we go to Ambassador Muchanga. In about 7 minutes, I would like you to tell us what exactly the problem. What is exactly the problem? We talk about debt issue in Africa. Give us some overview of the debt problem in Africa and what the AU has been doing, how AU has taken the leadership in addressing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator, and I would like to thank the U.S. Institute for Peace for inviting us to be with you this afternoon, and congratulate you together with our colleagues dealing with peace in Africa for organizing this event. We are very, very happy to be here. Before I answer the question, just 2 points. The first point is that when we are dealing at the level of the African Union, we talk of 55 African Union member states. That includes the Sahrawi Republic. That is the first point. The second point is that I've been very, very bad at marketing myself. Way back, I was appointed as the Commissioner for Trade and Industry. And one of my key deliveries was the African Continental Free Trade Area. And since then, the title of Commissioner for Trade and Industry has stuck. I've tried to get rid of it, it has stuck. My current title, because in 2021, we brought together 2 departments. So my current title is Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. So it is because of the issue of economic development that I'm here. Because economic development actually encompasses 3 portfolios: the Finance Ministry, the Economic Planning Ministry, and the central banks. We deal with all those issues in that portfolio. Having said that, Africa has gone through a number of debt crisis situations. And some of them, actually all of them, have been due to the structure of Africa's economy. Way back in 1974, there was a huge surge in the price of oil. And quite a number of institutions, including the IMF and World Bank, thought it was a short-term cyclical phenomenon. So a lot of our countries started borrowing in response to that. But beneath that, there was also a major transformation in the global economy. The pace of industrialization in the developed countries was not moving that dynamically. And therefore, the demand for commodities was going down except the oil. And as a result of that commodity crunch, a lot of countries found themselves in very severe debt situations. And they were borrowing from official creditors and also borrowing from the banks. And out of that was born the London Club. The Paris Club was already there. And at that time, in the 1990s, I was a young diplomat in New York with the Zambian mission there. We started negotiating, advocating for debt forgiveness. And eventually, it was agreed upon to come up with the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPIC, and the countries which qualified were able to see debt restructuring underway. And there were massive debt forgiveness arrangements, some as much as 60%. And now, when that was done, one of the impacts was that there was not going to be any major support from the banks and the official creditors. So the response was go to the bond market. And 2020, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, during that time, the process of borrowing through the bond market was already going on. And the term limits, one of the considerations was that the debts must be paid within 10 to sometimes 7 to 10 years. And when the pandemic hit, because of the low fiscal space, they found themselves, our countries, in debt situations. You have given the figures, and you have given the countries affected. So that's where we are. One of the first steps we took was to appoint a senior advisor on debt management. So work is underway now to come up with a debt monitoring mechanism through that senior advisor, so that we know the debt situation, the characteristics of the debt in each and every African country. Then we have also recognized that to solve the debt, we need structural transformation. So one of the key programs we have is a strategic framework on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development across Africa. And this is aimed at positioning countries of Africa to grow at 7 to 10% per annum. That's the first one. The second one is to come up with a strategy on export development and export diversification, so that we move away from production and export of commodities to manufactured goods. And the third one is to establish a single African market, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and move as soon as possible towards a common market or customs union. So a readiness assessment is there. So if we achieve export diversification, high rates of economic growth, and create a larger market space, would be able to really come up with a base for generation of domestic revenues. And with respect to domestic revenues, we also have a program working with the African institutions on trying to build the capacities of our member states, Ministries of Finance, central banks, the tax administration, to promote domestic resource mobilization. This is what we are doing. I'll end here. I think it's not more than 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ambassador. I like that you talk about structural transformation. It's one of the solutions we will get there, because I think African countries need to transform their economy. And when you look at in the year 2024, 2016, the oil price shock pushed many countries into a debt, budget deficit increase, because their revenue depend largely on oil export. So there is need to transform African economy, but this is a short-term solution. We need to find and this is long-term solution, and we need to find a short-term solution, because we can't wait. We can't transform African economies overnight. So I will turn to Jason. You build on what the ambassador has said and tell us, how did he get here? How did we get here? What are the underlying causes of African vicious cycle of indebtedness? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And let me stand on the protocol that has been laid by the ambassador, but also to maybe take one step back in the analysis of the problem that the continent faces. On many occasions, young economists who study in school, university, masters, and so on, often are given the 1970s as the starting point for the structural problems that affected the continent. But I wish for us to go back maybe 50, 60, 70, maybe even 100 years before the 1970s. And there's this small matter called colonialism that is often omitted in the history books, in the economic textbooks, when we're talking about the nature and manner in which our economies have come to be structured, the manner and in which our production sectors have been limited to the extraction of raw materials for the export. Indeed, primarily up until this day, the primary dominating theory or model of development for the continent is to extract raw materials and to feed medium and finished goods sectors in the global north, primarily to feed consumption in the global north, not on the continent. And so within that ecosystem, or that echo chamber that we are currently operating, finds ourselves that we're not a static continent. We have continued to grow as a population. We have continued to demand services from our governments. But one cannot do that if all you're exporting is coffee beans or cocoa or copper ore. And I use this because when I was in school in Nairobi, primary school, our teacher taught us that the main exports from Kenya were coffee, tea, and flowers. I'm not so old, but my children who are in school today are being taught that Kenya's major exports are coffee, tea, and flowers. And so you can see that there is a big problem as to why then our debt crisis on the continent is not only structural, it's systemic, it is sustainable because they've managed to sustain us at this very low level of production, but it is also deliberate. It is not by mistake. It is by design. The system that has been designed has been done so in a way to keep us at this very low level of production and value. The second point is to do with the way power asymmetries affect the ability of our continent to negotiate in a coherent and coordinated manner. Debt contracts, taking of loans, is a relationship between a lender and a borrower. Like friends and partners in the global north, they are usually very well coordinated and coherent in what they want. We, on the other hand, somehow have not managed to properly get that. We're getting there, but we've not yet managed to get that, particularly when it comes to issues of debt and negotiations. We did it successfully during, I think, HIPIC, the MDRI, when African governments together with African citizens came together and we said this was enough. We can't pay, we will not pay. And I think we are gradually getting to that sort of situation. But what is needed is a very important, coherent, and coordinated approach by the continent. And I commend here, Commissioner, Ambassador, for the Commissioner, they're the same, yes, for the appointment of the special advisor and pushing for this Africa debt monitoring mechanism, because this is going to be a game changer in how negotiations are conducted and how analysis is done about the debt situation on the continent. And lastly, because I know we have very limited time, we must appreciate that our creditor landscape has changed dramatically. This is to say that our reliance or dependence on bilateral lending has decreased significantly. We have also seen a gradual reduction in multilateral lending and an upsurge in private commercial borrowing, as well as non-traditional lenders. Now, some people may say that is an indication of how attractive the continent is to investors, to lenders. But essentially, lenders always have, no matter which category you place them in, they have one thing in mind, is return on their investment. They don't care whether you have 1 million or 1 billion people living in poverty. They do not care if your children don't go to school. They do not care if women are marginalized from the economic and productive sector. Their job is to give you money and to get it back at a return, because their shareholders, at the end of the day, when they're having their annual general meetings, need to see a dividend, a positive dividend, when they're having those meetings. And I think this is a very important dimension in what has perpetuated the current debt crisis on the continent, is that our inability to grow and develop our industries and domestic production has forced many African governments today to prioritize creditors, to prioritize lenders at the expense of African citizens. The policy advice that we are receiving, primarily from the international financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF, are actually perpetuating and deepening this crisis that we are currently facing. And so these are some of the few both political economy analysis, economic structural matters, and social dimensions in terms of power that have contributed and continue to exacerbate the debt crisis that we are facing on the continent at present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason, for your analysis and your remarks. Also, like the ambassador, you mentioned the lack of economic diversification as a problem, but you also blame colonization, even though I think that after 60 years we should stop talking about colonization and take our destiny in hands. And you talk about private creditor. Yes, the composition of African debt structure has changed. with increasing private creditors. But this also can be concerning because when there is a debt crisis, it's very difficult to get a deal with private creditors. As you say, they are not philanthropic. They are there to make profit. So that's also very important. Thank you for that. And I will move to Mrs. Chenai. I hope I'm pronouncing well your name.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Correct.
So after an overview of the causes of the vicious cycle of indebtedness in Africa, I will turn to you to ask you what African countries, the affected countries, can do domestically to ease their debt challenge, to create more fiscal space for development spending. Because currently, many African countries, instead of defaulting on their debt, are defaulting on their obligation to the future generation. So what can be done to create fiscal space, create more revenue to spend on development?
Thank you for that question, and it's a very important question within the context of the discussion on debt. So as mentioned, I work for an institution called Tax Justice Network Africa, and our major preoccupation is around how to support the work of African countries to raise domestic resources. And as you can imagine, domestic revenue mobilization is the other side of the coin when talking about debt and how we got there. So within the African continent, when we're thinking about domestic resource mobilization, the primary number that we look at is the tax to GDP ratio. So on the continent, on average, we have a tax to GDP ratio of about 15%. What does that mean contextually? Compared to all other regions in the world, we have the least tax to GDP ratio. In Latin America, it ranges between 20%, 25%, and then specifically within the OECD, the European Union, Western countries, it gets to as high as about 30%. So contextually, within the African continent, we are raising almost half of the amount of money that we could be raising when compared to other regions. So what does this mean? There is a lot of room for growth as far as this is concerned. And so when thinking about domestic resource mobilization, at TJNA, we think about a couple of things. Firstly, it's important for our governments to be able to raise more revenue. And how do they do that? There's a number of things that come into play. First and foremost, to what extent do we have the capacity to do so at national level? And so this looks at, for example, our revenue administrations. In a lot of African countries, these are insufficiently resourced, and so there's work that needs to be done to ensure that we have revenue authorities that can do this. It also speaks to some of the legislation that we have. The extent to which we have insufficient legislation at the national level means that there are various multinational corporations, high net worth individuals that are able to exploit these loopholes and essentially not play their part as far as contributing to the national purse is concerned. Also, what's really important, and this is to pick up from what the ambassador raised, we have economies that are also very largely informal. We have economies that are not as industrialized as they should be. And so that also limits the extent to which we're able to raise revenue from our economies to that extent. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to promote structural transformation. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to create value addition within our borders to maximize the amount of revenue that we can mobilize at domestic level. So there's a whole host of different elements that contribute to the domestic resource mobilization question. And then over and above that, when we're talking about domestic resource mobilization, an important element that needs to be part of the conversation is the how. Who carries the burden of contributing to the national purse? Unfortunately, in many African countries, we tend to find that we have regressive tax systems. We tend to find that particularly multinational corporations, high net worth individuals have lower effective tax rates than the average citizen, than, for example, SMEs, etc. And these are all issues that need to be tackled to ensure, one of the things that we always say at TJNA, that those who earn the most pay the most, that we have vertical equity when it comes to contributing to the purse. So these are all elements at national level that need to be taken into consideration. The extent to which we are unable to raise resources, is the extent to which our governments are then forced to look externally in order to fund their developmental objectives. That's why we have found some of our governments tend to go to external markets to raise the revenue that they need to then spend on things such as consumption, which ideally you should be dependent on your domestic resource mobilization to cover. And so there is a world in which, when thinking about the debt question, the tax question is an important element that needs to be part and parcel of this conversation. The extent to which we don't prioritize this discussion is the extent to which we are going to continue to see a perpetuation of the debt crisis that we're seeing on the continent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So you talk about domestic revenue mobilization, which is very important. Very important. I agree with you that Africa, as percentage of GDP, Africa raises less tax revenue than any other region in the world. So there's a room for improvement. A recent study by IMF, for example, said that many African countries, especially low-income countries, are far below their tax potential. By tax potential, I mean the maximum tax revenue that a country can raise given its economic structure and institutions. And so with appropriate policies, I think we can make progress in that front. So I will ask the ambassador to add some thought about how domestically we can ease our debt challenge and create fiscal space. Briefly.
Very briefly, there are two statements I like. And one of them is that demography is destiny. When you look at the African population, it's a young population. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's growing. Right now, we're about 18% of the global population. 2050, we're going to be 25%. 2100, between 38 to 40% of the global population. So with that, we are a huge consumption base. We need to leverage that. It's very, very, very important. The other statement I like is that discipline is destiny. If there is no effective governance across the nation, there's some sort of indiscipline. And if that happens, what has been highlighted comes about. You don't leverage your potential to generate the results that you need. So against this background, the task ahead for us is that to ensure that we leverage the resources that we have. Let us really come up with the key issues that we need to achieve. One of them is transformational leadership, good governance. We established very strong ministries of finance, which are able to really drive fiscal policy. We established very strong central banks, which are able to drive monetary policy, ensure that we don't have excessive levels of inflation, and be able to investigate incidences of illicit financial flows, money laundering. That is very, 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 very critical. And we establish very effective tax administrations that can work together with the rest of the economy to formalize the informal sector and ensure that multinational corporations and other individuals do not illicitly facilitate the outflow of capital from Africa, which currently I got to rank that is about 60%, $60 billion annually. So we need to promote effective governance for us to do that, and we need to leverage the population that we have, and of course you can add that the natural resources which are lying. We have not added value to all of them. Thank you. Sorry, I always make that.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Jason, briefly, if you can add some ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, first of all, it's stopping the leakages, illicit financial flows, debt servicing, account for a significant amount of leakages that are leaving the continent, which essentially makes the continent a net creditor, actually. to the rest of the world. And I think that's very important when we're having these kinds of discussions to understand why the continent is perpetually finding itself in a crisis, in crisis mode. I think the second point is, the analysis and the narratives that we are using. This is extremely important because if we are perpetuating the same narratives that are being put out there by our friends in the global north, then we too start to believe that the problems are predominantly internally to the continent. And I think this is a very important mindset shift that is needed. That, in the session during lunch, when the presentation was being made around climate and who should bear the biggest brunt, nowadays the narrative is how can Africa play its role in the climate resilient or climate transition. The question is, why should we have a role to play if we are the least polluters? And yet we're the biggest region that is being affected. So I think it's very important how language is being used to define and describe the problem, and therein also the solutions that are being provided. The third issue is around global economic and financial governance in terms of power distribution. It's very important that African leaders, the African Union Commission, continue to fight for more space, more voice in the way global governance is being handled. I think, for example, the inclusion of the African Union Commission in the G20 has, within it opportunities. I think the group of African countries within the United Nations has within it also good opportunities to move certain reforms and rethinking of global governance forward. The group of 77 also, plus China, also has a huge scope for those types of things in terms of moving the African agenda and the African voice. Lastly, and this is not to sort of brush under the carpet the internal challenges, governance challenges that we face as a continent. I think these are well known. They are well articulated and well documented. You don't need 4 Africans to come here and tell you that we have a governance. We all know that. But I think our job is not to perpetuate that, but it is to provide a counterbalance that lack of governance does not happen in isolation. There is an ecosystem, an echo chamber that facilitates those things from happening, and we must not run away from those facts of our lived reality. And my very last point is really in the debt crisis, as we try and look for solutions that are sustainable, that are structural, that are systemic, we must always remember at the very center of this crisis are human beings. I think the demographic dividend that the ambassador is talking about will not be met if we are mortgaging our future. It will not be met if we are talking about selling the critical resources that are critical to the West. It will not. That demographic dividend will not be met if we continue to think too much outwardly and not inwardly about some of these things. And given that we're here, that perhaps, because the title is Future Summit, perhaps there is an opportunity to reframe this debt crisis, this leakage crisis that we're facing as a continent, as an issue of national security. And that we have a right to defend ourselves against the vagaries of a very broken international financial system. And by national security here, I'm not saying we take up arms. I'm just saying perhaps we start thinking about inward protectionist type policies that we have hitherto not been allowed to think about, that allow us to generate and develop our own domestic industries that will contribute to the domestic resource mobilization that Chenai has referred to. Allow African countries to protect industries, to trade, to manufacture, and to sell to this wonderful market that's being created through the Continental Free Trade Area. So those are the few ideas and options that we can think about as we move forward. But reframing, and reorienting how we think about the problem is also equally important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you highlight public financial management, which is very important in Africa, improving spending efficiency, as the ambassador said, and also illicit financial flow, and improve good governance. I know study has showed that public investment efficiency in Africa is very low. For example, if African countries borrow $1 to invest in infrastructure, 60 cents go to infrastructure and 40 cents is wasted in corruption and poor selection of project. So this is an area that we need to work if you want to address, create more fiscal space in Africa, because if the money is well spent, then we can generate more revenue to pay back the debt and also invest in new investment. So that good governance and address corruption issue, I'm glad that you mentioned that, and also illicit financial flow. Recently, we are currently doing a study on Mozambique, and we realized that about between 2010 and 2014, about 10% of government revenue left the country illicitly. Imagine a country that highly relies on foreign on donors. 50% of the budget is from donors, and 10% of the revenue go outside. So this is a problem. So domestically, there is something we need to do to address this debt crisis. So now I will move to the international community, and I will direct my question to Chenai. What the international community, the broad international community, can do to help Africa address this debt challenge. People are talking about the reform of global financial architecture, and also the G20 common framework for debt treatment, all those issues, and debt relief, what the international community can do to help Africa.
Thank you for that question. I think my short response to that question is reform the global international financial architecture. And the reason I say that is this. You are indeed correct. There are a growing number of calls from the global south to reform the global financial architecture. So we saw this with the Bridgetown Initiative. We saw this with India's G20 presidency. We saw this with the Africa Climate Summit. And then earlier this year at the AU Summit, we saw the 3 heads of state from Ghana, Kenya, as well as Zambia call for the same. So there is an increased demand from the global south to reform the international financial architecture. Why is this important? I know you mentioned earlier, Mr. Moderator, that I think there were some conversations about, we need to set aside the effects of colonization and take, our future into our own hands. I think there's an element of truth to that. But it's important to recognize that we are still today living the repercussions of colonization. The current global international financial architecture we have today is one that was established in the 1930s, 1940s, before many African countries had even gained independence. And so what it means is that we have an international financial architecture that was established without taking into consideration the needs, the priorities, the concerns of developing countries, of African countries. And because they weren't at the table and able to effectively communicate this, we have an international architecture that does not, as I mentioned, take into consideration and is actually biased and skewed in favor of developed countries. And so when we are thinking about the bigger international financial architecture conversation, this needs to be the underpinning of our discussions. And so what are some of the things that need to be done? Within the tax space, Jason alluded to this, there's a discussion to shift where the global rulemaking on international tax happens. Currently, it is situated at the OECD, where we have the 38 richest countries discussing these global tax rules. 50% of African countries do not participate in that conversation. And the African countries that do participate in those conversations have argued that the rate at which those conversations happen, the specialization, the resources required to meaningfully contribute to those conversations doesn't take into consideration their specific context. And so there's a shift now for that conversation to move from the OECD to the United Nations, where one country can have one vote. And if you take a look at the countries that are leading this charge, it is the African group. This is reflective of the discontent that exists at present with regards to the international financial architecture. So the number one thing that I would say in response to your question, Mr. Moderator, around the international system and what we need to do it has to be this. We need to take a look at the very system within which we are existing. Because at the end of the day, unless we address the gaps, the loopholes that exist at the international level, we are undermining the national level, the domestic level work that we are putting in place. When you think about the international reform agenda, there's a couple of things that have been flagged by all of these different heads of state that are talking about the sort of way in which we need to change it. The first call that they make for is increased representation, right? So there's a demand, there's a call for increased representation in international financial architecture conversation, and so this looks like what was just mentioned earlier, where we have the AU now a part of the G20. This also looks like just the increased participation at senior level within, for example, the World Bank and the IMF. So increased participation of developing countries, of African countries in these spaces is important. But ultimately, as I mentioned, what we need to start to see is a truly inclusive and democratic spaces where these conversations can be heard. The extent to which you can address the representation issue is the extent to which the outcomes that take place in terms of the solutions that are being proffered to address the issues that we have at national level are solutions that are cognizant of the context of the countries that essentially are the ones that are in need of the solutions that need to be put forward to address the debt crisis, as well as the domestic revenue mobilization question as well. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. I think you realize the importance of the reform of the global financial architecture. So, Ambassador, if you can briefly also talk about the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment, briefly.
Thank you very much. Before I do that, my colleague here called for Africa to consider undertaking some protectionism to create the space for rapid economic transformation. We have a grand opportunity without calling it protectionism. And this is the African continental free trade area. And to make it work as really a strong buffer zone for economic development, we are urging member states to move as rapidly as possible to a customs union. When we have a customs union, we are going to have a common external tariff. With that common external tariff and a population of now 1.4 billion people, which is going to grow, and a huge reserve of natural resources, you are going to see huge inward inflows of investments, and that is going to transform the African economy. So we are urging member states to say, let us transform national sovereignty into collective sovereignty, and we will achieve the protectionism that you are advocating, and that is going to be in line with the provisions of the WTO. So I think this is where we are. The G20 is most welcome. We are already participating very, very effectively. It has the two tracks, the Shepherd track and the finance track. And altogether, there are about 30 work streams. And one of them is on the international finance architecture. And this is where we are looking at the question of the common framework for debt restructuring. What we have noticed is that it has been very, very slow. On the African countries, 4 countries have made use of it. Chad, Zambia, Kenya, and not Kenya, Ethiopia and Ghana. Those 4. And in a way, Chad has managed to do it, but Zambia was the test case. It took about 3 years before an agreement was reached. With regards to Ethiopia and Ghana, discussions are still going on, because for each one of them, one of the conditions is that you need an ongoing reform program within the International Monetary Fund. So both Kenya, with Ethiopia, and Ghana are still negotiating with the International Monetary Fund. Now, for a country like Zambia, which has succeeded, one of the key hindrances to rapid achievement of debt restructuring is the formula on comparability of treatment. Some of the parties feel that they are contributing more than the other parties in debt restructuring. So we have advocated really for reform around that area. And there also has been some cause to ensure that we have a manual on debt restructuring, so that we have a transparent document which can guide the process. But there's no agreement on that one. But in principle, there's agreement that we need to have a second look at the overall framework to ensure that it delivers on time and in full and with effect to ensure that it creates conditions for continued economic transformation, growth, and inclusive development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, it's an interesting discussion. It can be the subject of discussion for the whole day. So we are running out of time. I will move to the audience and take questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions to my panelists. So,
Commissioner, you said demographics is destiny. Now, I've done a lot of work on demographics. So the problem with Africa is that if we don't get on top of our demographic growth, we are not going to grow our ratio of working age people to dependents. One of the primary reasons why China grew so rapidly, and many other countries, is because the ratio of working age people to dependents got to a ratio of 1.7 and above. Africa only gets to that ratio of 1.7 and above by about 2060. So we are 3 decades away from, 2050, 3 decades away from entering a potential demographic dividend. So demographics is destiny, but it does mean we need to change the contribution that labor can make to growth. Very important. Second point you said discipline is destiny. One of the things that I don't understand is that Mozambique and many other countries, why can we not agree on radical transparency, that every debt agreement with a state-owned enterprise with state is that it must be transparent. So that was just, 2 issues that I feel are important. Thanks very much.
Let's take the second question. Then, and the third
yes,
one. Then
thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Daniel. I was really interested in the talk about expanding the tax base from Madame Chenai. In our country, Uganda, right now, we are having the traders and shopkeepers are boycotting. They have shut down all their shops starting yesterday and today, because some of us in the diaspora have been putting pressure on the World Bank and IMF to stop giving loans to our government, which are wasted in consumption, corruption, and so forth. So the government is now turning back to the people and trying to collect more revenue, but then we're ending up with double, triple taxation from the people who have already been paying taxes. So my question is, are there any case studies or any countries you have worked with? What areas have they been able to collect more taxes in Africa? As you said, we have a large informal sector. If you look at property taxes, some people, if you look at the kind of houses we have in rural Africa, how do you start taxing land and such property? So do you have any more specific, I know you talked about some of tax policy reform, strengthening tax administration, combating tax evasion and so forth, but are there any other areas where you think there are opportunities to expand the tax base in Africa? Because I think that's very important so that we can decrease the demand. Right now we're going to China, among other places, to collect more debt, which I'm very sure we're not going to be able to pay back. And we're going to end up defaulting like our friends in Ghana and some of the other countries which have recently defaulted and had to restructure their debt. So what other areas do you think governments can be able to collect more money, of course, without causing uprising, because there's also a trust deficit between the people and the government. They see how our ministers are living in luxury, they are sending money offshore and so forth. So I think it's a complicated issue, but at the same time, it's an area where there's a growth opportunity. It will be good to see if there are any more areas that you think governments can tap into to expand the tax base. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, moderator, and thank you so much to our panelists. I'm Jane Narunga. I come from Uganda, from an organization called Siatini. My question is to the Special Ambassador and also the other panelists, that it's true we need structural transformation of our economies if we are to exit debt. And I talk about exiting, not sustaining. We need to exit debt. So we need to structurally transform our economies. But my question, how do we do it? Because we are grossing over structural transformation. Why am I saying we are grossing over it? Because when you look at in Africa, what the agreements we are signing, I will give you just one example. Jason, you talked about the flowers and coffee and tea in Kenya. Kenya has just signed an agreement, an economic partnership agreement with the European Union, against the entire East African community, because we have a common external tariff as East Africa. But Kenya has gone ahead to sign an economic partnership agreement with the European Union to export flowers and fish. Okay? So yet, Ambassador, when you say that, okay, if as Africa, if we come up with a common external tariff, we are going to structurally transform our economies, we are not doing it in East Africa. How can we do it as Africa? So, and that's just one example of what we are doing in Africa, the agreements we are signing, the investment treaties we are signing. You talked about, Chenai and Jason, you talked about the outflow of resources, that we are net creditors. But we have liberalized our capital account, open, So there are things which we are doing, which don't support structural transformation in Africa. And lastly, it's also the issue of financialization of our economy. The real economy is now working for the financial sector. Everywhere they are throwing money at us, The bonds, the colorful bonds, the green bonds, the blue bonds, the orange bonds, And this is creating more and more indebtedness, but those bonds are not going to the real economy. So I think we need to think deeper when we talk about structural transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we'll respond to the first three questions, and later if we have time, we'll move to another series of questions. So, Ambassador, then we start from you.
Yes. Basically, the first observations by Dr. Yaxias is in agreement with what I said. Or I can say that, again, if we have to address the issue of the dependency ratio, we go back to China. And that is positioning the economy to grow at 7 to 10% per annum over a period of 10 to 30 years. Now, related to that is to increase the ratio of investment relative to GDP. China, at one time, went as far as 37% of GDP directed at investment. So we have to really, if we have to demonstrate a transformational leadership across Africa, first commit that we grow the African economy at 7 to 10% per annum for the next 30 years. And two, agree that we need to commit 35% to 40% of Africa's GDP towards investment. And that is going to lead to the transformation that you are talking about, to say, we talk about these things, we are not achieving them. It requires commitment to do it. And a good example is China. Within 30 years, they were able to emerge as the second biggest economy in the world. And then some of these issues where a country goes against established agreements, You've got the East African Court of Justice, something like that. So if a member country goes against the provisions to really adhere to a common external tariff, you take the country to court. Yeah, that's the only way. But as a way of coming out of, we should stop thinking the way we used to think. Let us now say, what do we need to do as Africa to create the future that we need to do? And the answer is that let's harness the resources we have. The natural resources, the people, everything is possible. And the countries create a single African market. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassadors. I think the question also were direct to other panelists. So Jason, if you want to add something.
Okay, I think I'll pick up on what the question that was raised by Jane on structural transformation, and I couldn't agree more. And I think this is where we come to have to better understand the dimension of power and politics when it comes to advice that's being given to our governments and to our countries. There is a huge power asymmetry in how we are able to analyze different agreements, different scenarios. I'm not saying that we don't have the intellectual or knowledge capacity. I think the capacity that perhaps we are sometimes missing is the human numbers. I was in a conversation yesterday evening and I was being told that ahead of the WTO ministerial in Abu Dhabi, the US had up to 5,000 bureaucrats working towards what they were going to discuss in Abu Dhabi. I don't know, I think that would have been the collective amount of African delegates, perhaps, that went to there. Yeah? And I think, and this is not to say that, so as when we talk about capacity, the ability to negotiate, to understand the implications, it's not the capacity of lack of knowledge or intellectual capability, it is the numbers, the sheer numbers. And I think we need to also go back to make working in public service attractive again. And that is where we'll start getting the innovative ideas that can take us towards structural transformation. Because up until now, when you speak with bureaucrats in civil service, a lot of them are overwhelmed. We were talking about the missions just up the train track in New York, who are involved in very intense conversations. And Chenai can tell you a lot about this, but you've only got one person who is meant to be dealing with up to 6 or 7 different tracks on tax, on debt, on climate, on international development cooperation, on systemic issues, on architecture reform. And this is just one person who in some cases might not be an economist, might not be a trade person, might not even be a lawyer, right? So we need to be able to deal with those internal capacity issues if we're really going to be talking about also the structural transformation agenda. And very lastly, I do think, and here I agree with the ambassador, how we start looking inward. The sanctions regime that we have, and maybe this is not the right country or room to use the word sanctions, they may get different ideas, but I think the point is very clear. I think we should find a way in which we are also holding each other to account. I think the case of Kenya is very well articulated in many places with regard to its transgression with the EPA, but we should have a mechanism where we can hold each other accountable in order for us to then have that coherent and coordinated approach. And I think we should also stick to the ministers of finance from the African Union member states who have called repeatedly for an overhauling and a thorough review of the G20 common framework. Because even as recently as yesterday, I think some of you will know that the deal with Ghana is now fallen off the table, yeah, because of some negotiation issues. And so I think we should continue with that call that this common framework is not common. In fact, it is anything but common in the way it is being used to affect debt restructuring and debt relief. And furthermore, this condition that you must have an IMF program is extremely, extremely disruptive to countries on the continent that are suffering with perpetual crisis, dealing with the COVID, dealing with the perpetual or the very systemic climate issue, dealing with the political instability that has been caused by Russia, Ukraine, and now, depending what's going to happen in the Middle East. All of those have very deep impacts on the African economy, and to condition us to have an IMF program that further entrenches takes up policy space, fiscal policy space from governments, is extremely regressive in terms of helping us get out of this vicious cycle that we're in. So I do think that call by the Ministers of Finance is extremely important, and we should heed it more now than ever, given what happened with Ghana just recently. Thank you.
Chenai?
Yeah, I think I'll just answer. There was a quick question around domestic resource mobilization. I think one of the things that we often emphasize when thinking about the ability to raise resources on the continent is that when you take a look at what is most responsible for sort of the insufficiency of our domestic resource mobilization, this is the concern of illicit financial flows that the ambassador just flagged. And when you take a look at what is most responsible for illicit financial flows out of the continent, 65% of that is due to the activity and behavior of global north multinational corporations on the continent. So our first step always, whenever engaging with governments, when talking about domestic resource mobilization, it is, number one, we need to look at measures that we put in place to curb the outflow of illicit financial flows. Ambassador mentioned that right now the statistic is close to $80–90 billion that as a continent we lose. Juxtaposed against how much we receive in terms of overseas development assistance, FDI, it's almost double of that. It's also half of what we need to achieve our sustainable development goals. And what those numbers show us is that, quite frankly, if we're able to maintain within our borders our own resources, we can actually make significant headway in achieving our developmental objectives. So what we always say first and foremost is don't use the easy route of putting in place VAT, right, where the pressure is most felt by particularly marginalized and lower income individuals. That's where you then start to see that pushback, those protests, right, by citizens, because they're able to perceive, right, the unfairness of the tax system. And so what we always say is start with measures that, number one, have you maintaining what's already yours, but also ensuring that you have progressive tax systems where you have the higher rate. And that looks different in different countries, right? So, for example, I know in Uganda they recently implemented a wealth tax. Not all African countries can do that, right? But it was able to work there. Others, you can see property taxes. And all of these are different ways in which you can ensure that what you have is a progressive tax policy. And I think just as I conclude, in response to the point that Jane made around structural transformation, I completely agree. We've been talking about this year in and year out. I mean, it goes back as far as the 1950s when Kwame Nkrumah himself was flagging this. It's important that we actually do the work of implementing that. And the point that Ambassador mentioned now around thinking about not national sovereignty, but collective sovereignty, I think is something that's really going to have us heading that way. How can we take advantage of our own internal market? The AFCFTA creates this opportunity, right? What can we do to ensure that it's not just another document that's well written and on a piece of paper, but then one that we actually actualize to have it benefit us directly? Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. Jim, we have a few minutes left. We'll take one or two questions. Okay.
Okay, thank you to our panelists and, of course, the moderator for highlighting very important ideas. I think from the previous sessions, we were reminded that about 3/4 of the AU budget is outsourced. And as we even popularize the continental free trade area, how is this different from other global liberalization policies advanced by the WTO, for instance? And we know that those policies have come to actually impact our SMEs negatively. The organization, the small industries or the small organizations within our countries have been affected negatively by those those policies. So how is the AU cushioning itself from such policies to make sure that the small countries, because we also know that countries are at different economic levels, right? So how are we making sure that as we implement that, these countries benefit or advance at a good rate? And how are we making sure that we are not reproducing kind of neo-colonial practices in these policies as we make them? Thank you.
Ambassador, in 1 minute. Yeah.
Beginning now. Yes. In the African Union Agenda 2063, there's a commitment that to effectively implement this agenda, 75 to 90% of the resources must be domestically mobilized. So in this connection, this is where the issue of domestic resource mobilization is being looked at. So we are really working towards that angle. But when now you look into the far future, in the medium term, you need to transform spending in such a way that what you spend at the national level is not replicated at the continental level. And to achieve that, you transform the African Union Commission into a supranational body. And you transform the Pan-African Parliament in South Africa into a legislative body, so that the decisions that are made out of that process become directives. Right now, they are consensus decisions. If a member state does not implement them, they are not sanctions. When they are directives, they will be sanctioned. And that is going to create a very, very strong African economy, which is self-sustaining, which is collectively sovereign. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, insightful discussion. Thank you very much to the panelists for your valuable contribution, and also to the audience for the engagement. Thank you very much. I think the key takeaway is that Africa needs to improve domestic revenue mobilization, better public financial management, and also push on structural transformation, address illicit financial flow, and the reform of the global financial architecture, and also the G20 common framework for debt treatment. If Africa will continue to pay its debt, it should not be at the expense of its future. Thank you very much.
Hello, all. If you all could please take a seat, we're going to get started. Sorry to cut off conversations that I'm sure are rich and wonderful. Hello, and welcome to the panel on the future of democratic governance in Africa. Before we begin, I want to introduce our panelists. I can promise you they're all very esteemed, and if you Google them, you'll find out. But I'm not going to spend time reading their bios, because they've got great things to say, and I want you to hear them. But Dr. Fonteh Akum is the Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies. Oge Onubogu is the Africa Director of the Wilson Center. Susan Stigant is the Director at the Africa Program here at USIP, and Joseph Asunka is the Executive Director of the Afrobarometer. So welcome to our panel. Thank you. Thank you all. They also all happen to be very good friends of mine, so I have great respect for them. I'm very grateful to be in conversation with them today. And Susan, thank you for making sure this is not a West Africa panel. This was almost a West Africa problem that we're going to talk about, so appreciate you helping us out there. So for the purpose of this panel, we're going to spend about 40 minutes or so in conversation with me asking the panel questions, and then we're going to have 20 minutes of Q&A with the audience, and then about 10 minutes of closing remarks at the end. So that's how we're going to make this work, give or take a few minutes here and there. But before I turn to the panel, I want to just set the stage a little bit. Since 2020, there's been 8 coups on the African continent, and across the continent, we're seeing economic decline, governance challenges, and continued negative aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. Several countries, and particularly in West Africa, have also suffered from a growing extremism, and there's also the youth population that continues to grow. Several of these things we've talked about here today, and I'm hoping our panelists can help us tease that out. And the United States, as an ally of the US government, often seems caught in a cycle of what I consider confusion, dismay, and inaction. Not from a lack of will, but from a lack of how do we do and how do we respond to these things, right? And for its part, the African Union, which actually has mechanisms to address some of these problems, often finds itself also unable to act or unable to act effectively enough. Perhaps that's a lack of legitimacy. Perhaps that's any number of issues. Desiree will tell us why it's actually pretty good, but it's not entirely so. We're going to talk more about that. And across the continent, though, we do see a demand for democratic traditions and a yearning for improved governance. We also see citizens who have a desire to have a voice and a vision for their future that unfortunately sometimes their leaders have not helped match. And so today what I'm hoping is Fonteh, Susan, Oge, and Joe will help us talk through some of these issues, but also give us some potential solutions that we might be able to think about. And I'd like to begin with Fonteh and talk about why it seems like, at least from my perspective, in the 1990s, we talk about the coups a lot on the African continent, but they seem to be back. So help us understand why coups seem to have come back and if there are similarities in the places where you've seen them occur.
Thanks a lot for that introduction and for the initial question as well. Looking at the coups which have taken place on the continent, I think you need to step a little further than 2020 and start with Zimbabwe, for example. So you could categorize them into three sets. The first set are coups which took place against long-serving leaders, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Omar Hassan el-Bashir. It was a revolution which was followed by a coup, and in Chad, an unconstitutional change of government, which saw Mahamat Debi coming to power as a transitional leader. The second set of countries are countries which were going through transitions themselves. So the coups that we saw in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea are actually coups that emerged from transitions gone wrong to a large extent. And I think we need to interrogate exactly how those transitions went wrong. The third set of coups, or the third coup pretty much category, would be one which fits neither in the first nor the second category, which is the coup we saw in Niger, where you're moving towards the consolidation of a transition following 3 successive elections, and then you saw a coup. So those different dynamics basically provide different sets of explanations for coups, and I think we could sum them up across about 5 different spaces. The first is regime fatigue, right? Regime fatigue that we saw in long-serving countries. And what does regime fatigue say about countries where you have presidents who have led for over 3 decades and who are aging? And how would we envisage transitions in those countries? And this kind of forecast the ideas about coup transitions. The second observation is elite rivalry between 2 general groups, a group of securocrats within the establishment and plutocrats, if you could describe them in that sense. And in most of the coups where we have seen long-serving leaders deposed, the plutocrats have never won the battle to take over. They have always been won by securocrats. And the third is, particularly within transitional countries, is the question of governance effectiveness and the gap between the delivery on one hand of government services and the expectation of government, particularly running against the tide of a number of multidimensional crises that these countries were facing. And in the Sahel particularly, you cannot avoid interrogating the pressures posed by terrorist movements on this government and their capacities to effectively respond to them. The fourth dimension, of course, points to much more of the structural issues that have been mentioned here on the economic front, but which also exist on the political front as well. And lastly, you need to interrogate the capacity for institutions to escape capture from specific political elites. So those different dimensions actually cover the gamut across 3 sets or categories of coups that we have seen across the continent. And I might have missed some, of course, but I'm sure the audience would point that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fonteh. I appreciate the nuance and the different origins of, but also the emphasis that you just ended with, the lack of governance effectiveness in the face of multidimensional crises. I think when we think of why these things happen and whether there's a turn to extremism or turn to coups, there is this lack of effectiveness that we have to think about. Okay, I wonder if you can talk to us about this. It's been pretty clear that coups don't occur in a vacuum, as Fonteh just talked about, right? There's a role that the international community can play and should play in arresting these and the root causes of them. So taking the African Union and the regional economic communities as one aspect, or I guess two, multiple different regions and the AU, there's essential stakeholders. So what role do they have to play in supporting countries before they reach the coup stage? And what options do regional policy engagements and approaches have in the context of frozen transitions?
Thank you very much, Kehinde. And I'm going to try to see how I respond to this. And it is a pleasure to be here for this conversation. I applaud all of you that have been here since 9 a.m. this morning. And now you're ending the discussion with governance in Africa. Well, congratulations on that one. So let me pick up from where Fonteh stopped as he laid out what the environment looks like. Clearly, this is a very challenging environment. And as you rightfully pointed out, coups do not occur in a vacuum. And I think all the points that Fonteh has raised as he laid this picture for us has actually painted a picture of a challenge with the structure, the state-society structure as it exists on the continent today. Increasingly, that question about the capacity of the state and the capacity of the different institutions to be able to effectively respond to the needs of citizens. And then alongside, you have an increasingly aware citizenry that is demanding more from their governments. And Joe might talk more about this on the Afrobarometer side as we see data of citizens that continuously demand for better representation. And now we're stuck in a space where we're asking ourselves, are these states able to deliver on the outcomes of democracy? And I think pulling on that thread of, asking, clear the fact that, yes, coups do not occur in a vacuum, but what can regional bodies like the AU, the continental bodies like the AU, and regional economic bodies like ECOWAS, IGAD, and the rest of them do in a situation like this? I think if we go coming from 2023 all the way going to 2025, we'll see that there are a number of elections that are scheduled to occur on the continent. In this year alone, we're looking at about 19 elections that are scheduled. Keynote on scheduled, not all of them are going to happen. They're scheduled to happen on the continent this year. And at the backdrop of where we see concerns with governance across the continent, you always see the questions of flawed elections and the questions of poor governance. So this provides an opportunity for the AU and the other regional economic bodies to take a forward-looking approach to how we address some of these issues. Now, at the end of the day, the AU and ECOWAS, there is a lot of emphasis that is put on election observation missions, and that's great. It's great to have that visibility, but then it's then what? What happens afterwards? And I believe that is a gap that we see time and time again. Often the mistakes that we see when you talk about a stalled transition, the mistake that we see countries tend to make over and over again is that, especially when a country has experienced a military takeover, the transition often ends up being the same. It's often the same conversations that we're having when we're talking about a transition. Perhaps it's time for us to start moving from this conversation about a transition to a transformation. Can we think about new systems that come after a coup? Can we think about how organizations like the AU and the regional economic bodies can actually position themselves effectively with the tools that they have to be able to work in a space where they can prevent? And then going back to the question about the tools, I think we have to do some deep soul searching and really ask ourselves if the tools that the AU has today, from the peace security architecture, the Africa peer review mechanism, all the different tools that the AU has at its disposal, the AU and the regional economic bodies, are those tools effective to be able to solve the challenges
that we see on the continent today, the governance challenges that we see on the continent today? That's a question that I'm throwing out there. I don't have the answer. But, looking at what we see across Africa today, we have to seriously ask ourselves the question if the tools are effective. Is the AU itself actually well positioned in a space of prevention? Is there a focus on conflict prevention or more just responding to crisis at this point? I know the AU had the continental early warning systems, and folks like Yaki and others in the room who were involved many years back in designing tools like this for early warning. Right now, those tools are not as effective as they were because the AU has really focused more on structural adjustments and not necessarily adjustments to address some of the systems within the body. So I think, one, really asking ourselves if the tools that the AU and the regional economic bodies have at their disposal are effective for the challenges as we see them today. And third, really going back to the idea of the question of who takes the lead. When we ask about how the AU or regional economic bodies can be able to address or prevent these challenges or prevent a coup before it happens, within the AU, there's always been the discussion on subsidiarity, who takes the lead. And we've seen that this has also created, there's a gray area here. And that the response, and because of this gray area, the response has not been consistent across the board. We see the response in Chad was different from the response in Zimbabwe. We see the response in Côte d'Ivoire is different from the response in Guinea. So at the end of the day, we have to bring to the forefront, I think it's this presents an opportunity to really have so to say, the AU to have a come to Jesus moment, to really figure out if this conversation on subsidiarity, who really takes the lead here? Because now it has really turned into more of a political discussion and not necessarily one focused on effectiveness. And especially now in today's environment where you have countries that are within the regional bodies, for instance, in the case of your AES countries, so Burkina, Niger, and Mali, asking to leave or putting in the request to leave ECOWAS. They weren't that polite, asking to leave ECOWAS. This is a question where you have to ask yourself, okay, what role does is this really a space for ECOWAS to play a role, or is this where the AU needs to step up? So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you. And two things I'll highlight from what you said there. The 19 elections on the continent in the next, you said the next year. Did I get that?
19 elections scheduled for this
2024.
year, 2024.
Yeah, and how that's a way for the EU to actually be proactive in addressing some of these challenges and the root causes. And then the idea that there is, are the EU tools fit for purpose? I really like that framing. And if not, how do we revise them? How do they revise them for what is necessary? Thank you. And Susan, let's talk about the US government. The context will differ in many cases, right? But broadly speaking, what do you think the U.S. government should be doing in countries that are dealing with instability to help prevent a coup to begin with? And once a coup has occurred, what should the U.S. government do if a coup has occurred?
Thanks, Kehinde. The interesting thing about this panel is I think it's full of people who are usually the moderators and not the speakers. So I should say at the outset, USIP, of course, does not speak for the U.S. government. I think the engagement by the United States really depends on what the particular drivers are across the different dimensions that Fonteh laid out at the beginning. We recently heard from some colleagues who visited from the AU that their main message was engage, engage, engage. And I think that's really good advice. There are many different ways to engage. There's engagement that's very public in nature. There's engagement that talks about norms and standards. There's engagement that pushes people. There's quiet discussions behind closed doors. There are deep relationships with security actors in the military, in civilian security, in intelligence, that I think could help the United States to understand the fears, concerns, aspirations of people who might take steps, who might enable, or who might give a permissive environment for a coup to take place. So I think those are all incredibly important aspects. I think the other thing that the U.S. and partners more broadly can be doing is thinking about the readiness of a country to manage, endure, and respond to a situation where a coup takes place. And so part of that is legal. Part of it's understanding what are the frameworks, what happens, what should be actually catalyzed. Part of it's political. And I think a really important part of it is talking with civilian actors. When I say civilian actors, I don't mean civil society only. I'm talking about political entities, I'm talking about unions, I'm talking about former diplomats, former military leaders, people who are shaping policy decisions and calculations in countries. And I think those are really critical aspects to build the network, the infrastructure, the trust that's needed to respond in really difficult circumstances. When coups do take place, I hear a lot of people talking about whether a coup is a coup, or whether it's a good coup or a bad coup. Obviously, those are debates that the African Union has to discuss itself within the Peace and Security Council and determine how they're going to act. It strikes me that it's not particularly helpful for the United States to deliberate, debate, dialogue, and hold on declaring whether something is a coup or not. So I think a swift determination is very important. Obviously, there are legal implications and constraints on funding that result, and assistance and partnership that result from that determination. And I think similarly to thinking about, are the tools fit for purpose? I think the United States has an important conversation to say, when there are constraints on assistance because of a coup, what are the other pathways that exist to keep open the engagement that was necessary beforehand, even more necessary afterwards, to ensure that the roadmap, the pathway, has a chance of getting back to democratic, civilian-led, and peaceful dispensations.
Thank you, Susan. So there's a request for the U.S. to continue to engage, right? There's also the U.S. should engage citizens beyond civil society, so the key stakeholders, whether it's businesses, whoever else should be at the table. And then this last point of swiftly determine a coup and not navel gaze of, is this a coup? What does this mean if we call it a coup? And all those things. Those are excellent points. Thank you. Joe, let's talk about the Afrobarometer. So you all do polls, and you've been doing this. I love the Afrobarometer. I've been a huge fan since 2008 when I started paying attention to these things. So even as we've seen coups occur, we see that there's a lack of governance, but we see citizens continuing to demand this, right? So there's a demand for governance, demand for democratic traditions, right? Can you help us nuance that top line, though, sort of like over time as you all have been doing this? Is there, what does that trend line look like for democracies, for the demand for democracy, as people tend to see this, what Fonteh and Oge talk about as there's a lack of delivery of services, there's a lack of delivery of governance, yet people continue to yearn for it. So has that ebbed and flowed over time, and what does that look like, if you can help us through that, see that trend line better?
Right. Thanks so much. I'm glad you've asked me to talk about Afrobarometer and not about governance, because that's a much bigger. But I mean, you're right. I think across the continent, and that's the good news I'll bring to the governance discussion, because when you talk about governance in Africa, it's always a gloomy picture. But I think from the citizen perspective, there's a lot of good news there. But of course, there's a nuance that we need to bring to the fore because of what Fonteh and Oge just mentioned in terms of the delivery side. But on the demand side, so we often want to talk about governance and democracy on the continent from the citizen perspective of Afrobarometer. Afrobarometer is a public opinion survey that we conduct in about 40 countries on the continent. So what we've been asking citizens about is the demand side. How much and how resilient are they in terms of their support and commitment to democracy and democratic governance? Across the continent, throughout all our surveys we've done since 1999, the commitment to democracy remains very high. It used to be much higher in the 1990s. It's come down a little bit, but it's still a majority view that more than 3/4 of Africans
say that they support democracy. I said 2/3 support democracy. At the same vein, as mentioned here, talking about military coups, there are some countries we've seen citizens come out to the streets to celebrate coups because, and there's a sense of, are these people in favor of military rule? But that is not the case, and I can provide a little more nuance as we go along. But same 66% of Africans reject military rule. Okay, and so often when you think about the way coups have happened, it all comes down to the issue of the delivery side. I'll talk briefly about the delivery as well. But majority support democracy, 66%, majority reject military rule. And when it comes to one-man rule or one-party rule, as Fonteh just mentioned, regime fatigue is one of the things that citizens on the continent really hate. And so almost 80% of Africans don't want one-man rule, and they don't want one-party rule. So those are roundly rejected. The only authoritarian form of government that seems to be having some sympathies with the citizens on the continent is the military. And you've seen that it used to be about 80% rejection in about 2014. That has declined over time. And so that's probably the nuance I want to put there. So even though Africans do not want military rule, the extent to which they resisted military rule in 2014 is much stronger than it is today. So about 10 percentage point drop between 2014 and now. But it is still a majority rejection. So even though it used to be 75%, it's come down to 66% of Africans who say they don't want military rule. But the fact is that it has deteriorated over time, and we need to be careful. What does that mean? Why are citizens becoming more and more sympathetic to military rule? But the underlying fact is that majority still reject it. So it's not the case that majority are in favor of military rule. They reject military rule. And some of the drivers that we've seen in the data, as mentioned by Fonteh and Oge here, is from the delivery side. And the delivery is not just the economic goods. Actually, the economic goods are secondary. And I'll come to that shortly. It is the delivery of this political governance that people are concerned about. To what extent are governments able to deliver quality elections? How are they able to fight corruption in particular? And especially corruption at the local government level. When local government do not work or there's perceived corruption at local government level, that's the one thing that really erodes people's commitment to democratic governance. And so I think in more and more as we think about how to improve, maybe sustain people's commitment to democracy on the continent, and maybe I'll just mention two things, but of course there are different factors that we've found. One being the issue of quality elections. Whenever people perceive elections to be of good quality, they are more likely to be committed to democratic governance and norms. And when there's perceptions of corruption, especially at the local government level, it also drives down people's commitment to democratic governance. The only thing where we see economic factors having a challenge in terms of declining commitment on the continent is satisfaction with the way democracy works. It is not people's commitment to democracy and democratic norms. Those ones, we don't see the economic factors, whether it is poverty or whatever you use as an economic measure. It doesn't really impact people's commitment to democratic governance. What it affects is their satisfaction with the way democracy actually works. And so we make that distinction between the demand for democracy and, of course, the supply side, which is the satisfaction side as well. So what people want and their commitment to democracy is not affected by economic factors. It is the extent to which they are satisfied with the way democracy works. That one, immediately you throw in an economic variable, it brings it down. People are not satisfied, but they still remain committed to the principles of democracy and democratic governance. But I'll stop there. Maybe I'll take up others as we go along.
Thank you. That's I'd like that distinction a lot. The satisfaction with democracy has to do with the economic impacts that people feel, but not necessarily whether or not they want democracy. Right? That's important. And then you also talked about the extent to which folks are rejecting military still, but at a declining rate, which I think comes back to the points that Oge and Fonteh have made in terms of how people perceive these things. And I also think this distinction around how local governments and the local governance affects people's desire and understanding of democracy, because that's what they see most vividly in their home, within their own homes, right? Fonteh, we talked about the African Union a lot today. We talked about the regional economic communities. And I would venture to say that there's a crisis of legitimacy with the African Union, right? I don't know that I would go as far as Mbemba did this morning and say throw it away. I think that's quite provocative and perhaps too far. But at the same time, an institution that has Biya in its membership, has Museveni in its membership, the list can go on, strikes me as there's something wrong there, right? And so curious from your perspective, how can African countries, where the leaders have aged and where there are no definitive succession plans, in those contexts, how can multilateral institutions and international institutions help prepare to support democratic leadership transitions? Hopefully they're democratic. And with whom should they be engaging proactively with to build relationships long term?
Desiree is back in the room, No, that's an interesting question, right? But we've got to separate the moral argument on whether the Biyas and the Musevenis need to sit there and stick with the institutional arguments to begin with, which is the African Union is an intergovernmental organization, and it assembles the heads of state on the continent. The bigger question, I think, is how whether it's suffering from a crisis of legitimacy. From the conversations earlier this morning, right, which multilateral organization is not facing some kind of interrogation on its raison d'etre at the moment, and on what its outcomes and outputs exactly are, right? And the African Union is no exception. And that is also refracted to the regional economic communities, whether you're looking at Sudan's exit from IGAD or the exit, which Oge spoke about, of the Sahel states from ECOWAS. So there's a real interrogation of the raison d'etre behind regional economic communities and the AU at the moment. The second observation is about the fact that as intergovernmental organizations, they are only a sum total of the capacities of the states that are members to these organizations. So in some spaces, you could argue that whether the African Union as well as the RECs can only perform as well as the member states give them the capacity and the political bandwidth to actually act. And at the moment, both the AU and the RECs on the continent are very hamstrung in the ability to effectively respond to some of the pressing issues. The third observation is the AU's institutional architecture has expanded quite a bit since the transformation from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And Oge mentioned the APRM, but we should also mention the AGA-APSA Secretariat. The key question there would be to interrogate their effectiveness as tools for advancing democratization on the continent, vis-a-vis the institutional reforms within the African Union as well, which have created the political affairs, peace and security structure, which at the moment is also a little overburdened and overwhelmed by all the transformations that are taking place on the continent. So the short answer would be that at the moment, the regional economic communities and the African Union will be ill-adapted to effectively respond to some of the challenges that they faces. The question then goes, where would the responses come from? The first we have to go back to state-society relations, right? Because when you talk of governance, you're looking at the broad question of deep inclusion and what roles do societies play to actually hold their governors accountable. The second issue that we've got to interrogate about states as well is the capacity to provide the kind of security goods that are expected by the citizens, and that speaks as well to the social contract. And the third issue you've got to ask is the capabilities of the state to exercise full territoriality. And on all of these matrices, I think most African countries fall short, and therefore they work within sort of this distorted space where they've got to contend with internal challenges while at the same time trying to counter, while at the same time trying to reify a certain sovereignty which is already reduced by these challenges which they face. And that is further complexified by the fact that in reifying their sovereignty, they are actually diminishing the potential supranationality of regional economic communities and the AU. And within that complex context, advancing the democratic agenda on the continent would be about partnerships. It would be about local activism as well. It would be about leadership within the political class, and it would be about institutions. Because in fact, one of the first elements of state capture that we see in trying to undermine the democratic processes is the constitution, constitutional manipulation, and the capture of the constitutional courts, which then leads to sort of the validation of the will. We are seeing it happen in Togo at the moment. We saw a constitutional change in the Central African Republic as well. So we have to be able to respond to those effectively. And at the moment, given the current context, it would be difficult to see how the regional economic communities, which are struggling with an identity crisis, can actually address those effectively, and with the African Union as well. Thanks.
Thank you. That expansion of multilateral institutions, not just the AU, are having a crisis of like, who are we and what do we do? I think that's an important point. So yes, I don't take back my accusation, but nonetheless, I think it's an important point. Susan, can we talk about financial assistance? And if you can talk to us about what support, well, let me back up a little bit. So the African Union is largely supported by outside actors, right, in terms of the funds that it receives and how it, given the lack of dues that members pay, right? So if we think of financial assistance, what support could be provided to the AU and the RECs to combat this economic influence of malign actors? And also, what pressures can multilateral institutions apply to dissuade unconstitutional governments from embracing malign state actors? We can think of Wagner, we can think of any number of actors. Take a look.
Big questions. And maybe before I dive into your question, I do think it's worth taking a moment just to acknowledge that the strength of the African Union institution is that there is an established, enshrined norm against coups. And probably everybody in this room takes that for granted, but it's not the case in any other multilateral institution around the world. So the way that we're having this conversation is fundamentally shaped and grounded in a commitment that was made by states, pushed by citizens, hard won because of what people had lived through, experienced, informed by their hope, desire, and aspiration for democracy, and then written in to the fundamental principles of the African Union. And so this isn't to try to dissuade you from your opinion, Kehinde, but I do think we don't say that out loud enough. And the fact that that commitment is there and exists also shouldn't be taken for granted. So to your question about financial assistance, first, I think the development of the AU Peace Fund is an important step, an important aspect. Before the conversation goes too far on financial assistance, I think it's important for the African Union to have a conversation about what it is they would wish to do. And so the resurgence of coups has, I think, left many of us without the tools, without the plans, without the ideas about how to engage leading into them. And so it strikes me that first and foremost that's an incredibly important priority. I would also say that we collectively need to rethink about how we're engaged leading into elections. My fear is that of the 19 that are scheduled, if there is a risk, we are too late. And we tend to think about the risk post-election or in investing in the electoral institutions to gain credibility. But in many countries, there's an entire question of how the political system is constructed and developed. So changing the leader won't change the lack of a credible political party. Changing a leader won't change whether governments at a local level or at a national level are accountable to their people. And so it strikes me that there's a much more fundamental conversation to have, which is the state-society conversation, but maybe just to put a bit finer of a point on it. Malign actors, maybe we can come back to that in Q&A, because I feel like it's such a broad bucket, and I don't know that I can do it justice without taking away from Joe's time.
Fair. And I take your point about the enshrined principle within the African Union. I think I take it for granted. I think many of us in this room do take it for granted. And as we criticize the AU, I think that is an important starting point of we cannot have this conversation about many other institutions where that is the norm, or it's a given. How it's enforced and how it actually plays out in real time matters as well, but the actual principle is important. I take that point. Okay, I want to come to you to talk about citizens, right? We've talked a lot about the international community and sort of like broadly, whether it's the AU, the African Union, the US government, but let's talk about citizens, and here, taking the point that I think Susan made earlier around it's not just civil society, it's also businesses, it's also any number of institutions that are key stakeholders, any number of interests that are key stakeholders in a country. But what role do they have to play in ensuring actual political transitions, and what opportunities might there be to engage them earlier in the process of transitions that may not be going well?
Thanks, Kehinde. And I just want to acknowledge Susan. Susan always has a way of seeing the positive in everything. It's the Canadian in you. So, so to your question about citizens, I think it is clear, full stop, just listening to the conversations here today, that there is a need to renew the social contract between citizens and their governments, full stop. And this push for transitions, we will continue to see it happen on the continent, and it will even intensify further, given the fact that Africa is the youngest continent, and the agitation that we see are coming from young people, as we just recently saw in the case of Senegal. This will continue to happen. You continue to see a population that is not ready for the same types of transitions, but actually wants to see a transformation. West Africa in particular is really at an inflection point at this time, where it could go either way. It could go in the way of seeing progress in terms of good governance and effectively functioning democratic institutions, or it could go the other way, where we see a lot of insurgencies and insecurity. So it's really, and West Africa in particular, is at an inflection point. And I think this is where we have to think clearly about how we engage citizen voices in these conversations. And then when we talk about civil society is not one homogeneous unit. I think even for us in the room, for all of us here in the room, we've gotten to a point where we just say, let's engage civil society. And we end up engaging the same organizations that we've been engaging for the last 20 years in the same discussions ongoing. So as much as how we think about how citizens engage on the continent, it's also a question for all of us here in the room that work in different organizations or run different projects where we have to engage citizen voices. How do we identify the organizations that we work with? How do we identify the people that we work with to the point that it goes beyond your sort of formal civil society organizations across the continent? We've seen a rise in social movements across the board. How do we engage these social movements effectively? Is there a mechanism that exists within the US government, in our international organizations, to effectively engage with these social movements? Because at the end of the day, you can have movements that can push to perhaps get an individual out of office, but then what happens next? How do we assist them in the organizing process? how do we assist them in the long term? And I think going back to the point that I made about election observation and the fact that ECOWAS and the AU is really, effective when it comes to creating that visibility in election observation. But what happens after the election observation process? How do we continue engaging beyond just that, the few days that we're there on the ground? So the visibility is great, but then what happens afterwards? And I think with civil society, I think to the point that has already been made by my co-panelist here is that surveys continue to show us time and time again that citizens value democratic systems of government above all other. Citizens value the right and the opportunity to be able to select their own leaders. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we effectively think about how we engage with citizens on the ground. I think how we create that space to have effective conversation leading up or even before a coup happens, not only waiting until after a coup happens and we start struggling to find different dialogues and going around and organizing different summits and workshops and meetings, and how do we move from that point? And I think there is an opportunity now because there is greater citizen awareness on the continent today, especially among youth, that the governance that they're getting or what their leaders are providing is not right. So really thinking about how we effectively engage those voices. Think about academia. In a lot of the academic institutions on the continent, there's a lot of effective research that is ongoing. But how do we translate that research coming from the different academic institutions into a way that will make sense to policy actors? Across our academic institutions on the continent, there is a lot of work and research ongoing. But being able to translate all of that work and make it useful for a policy audience, there is that disconnect too as well. I think we find out that on the continent, likewise in the US and in the international community, we tend to stick to our different silos. Academics are speaking to academics. Those in the economic sector are speaking to others in the economic sector. Those in health are in the health meetings. But across the continent, we see that these issues are all interconnected. How do we bring these voices together in forums that are connected? Summits like this, discussions like this, and that's why I really love the Africa Futures tool, because it goes across board. These types of discussions that can actually show an intersection. The business community, for one, too, as well, the small business community. These are individuals that may not be identified as your traditional civil society organizations, but really thinking about how we engage them. And I think one thing I find really curious is that whenever I'm on the continent and you actually go to different conversations, everyone, to some extent, is knowledgeable about the challenges with the political system. You might be at a religious function and everyone is talking about how, providing solutions about to resolve certain issues. So we have to break from the norm. We have to break from business as usual when it comes to identifying the partners that we work with and identifying those that we engage with. And I think the opportunity is now, the time is right, because data shows us that citizens want to engage. And this trend in democratic transition, it's not going to stop in Africa. It's going to continue because it's a very young population and young people are demanding better governance. Young people are demanding better democratic outcomes. So it's not going to stop. So we have to think outside the box in our engagement with citizens.
Thank you. And I think this point about the greater need for a new social contract between citizens and government and citizens is an important one. And at NDI, we often talk about how elections are not an event, right? It's the everything post-election. I think you made a lot of those points today. So I think, would love to have folks talk about that in the question and answer period. And Joe, I want to come back to you one last time. So before the Afrobarometer, you were in philanthropy for about 5 years or so, working on how to fund government accountability, right? Can you talk about this expansion of beyond the citizen and expanding who the citizen is, and talk about the role that philanthropy private sector, any number of actors who have resources can play in helping to steward political transitions or to help make sure citizens who want to have a say are having their say?
All right, so maybe I can just talk to one issue, and I hope that becomes my core takeaway. First of all, talking about young people on the continent. The work that I did previously in my previous life was about citizen participation. How do you mobilize citizens to engage with their governments to improve service delivery across the continent? I think the first thing I want to mention is when I talked about the issue of the militaries and then coups. The data does show over time, especially the last time that we asked the question, should the military intervene if your elected leaders abuse their power? And unfortunately, majority of Africans said yes. And it's a slim majority, but it's still a majority, about 50-something%. The concerning outcome of that question is the fact that younger people were more likely to say the military should intervene. And so there's that hunger of young people on the continent to see change. And I said I'm going to talk about one thing because I still want to go back to elections. If you provide the opportunity for young people and they know that they can vote their government out, as it happened in Zambia or it happened in Senegal recently, they will do it. And I think if we are able to provide election infrastructure that provides citizens the confidence that they can actually vote and get a government out of power or bring a government into power, that will be super critical. And I think in some ways, our data does show whenever elections are perceived to be of high quality, people have greater commitment to democratic governance, and they are also more likely to be satisfied with the way democracy works, and the trust in the electoral management bodies also continues to improve. So one thing I might advocate is maybe two things. One, the election infrastructure that is in place. Now, increasingly, there's a lot of technology being used in election management. The question is, how do we make sure that the infrastructure for election management is done in such a way that people can have confidence in that? If we leave the procurement of election management infrastructure to individual governments who go outside of the continent to source software to come and run elections, we will still continue to run into these problems. Is it possible to have a centralized management of election infrastructure on the continent that is a shared resource, maybe centrally or regionally managed on the continent, where I'm confident that the elections that are being run in my country, in Togo, the server that holds those results are seated somewhere on the continent and not in Europe. Because I may not have that trust that a server that is sitting in the United States here can really be trusted to maintain the quality. But can we have a system, a mechanism on the continent where these resources are shared? Because when it comes to regulation, how do you regulate the use of technology in elections? If you have a centralized management system on the continent where we have a standard way of kind of regulating the use of software in elections to improve citizen trust in it, I think it can go a long way to help deal with that. And so in some ways, maybe this is one of the areas where the African Union can be useful, that there's a centralized way of dealing with this, such that the investments that Togo needs to make in its election system, that's not just to be Togo's responsibility alone, but it's a shared responsibility, but that countries then can contextualize it within their systems. So for me, I think making sure that elections work and they work effectively, that is where you will see young people really being mobilized. And I think when young people really mobilize on the continent, the issue of accountability would grow from there. And I just hope that we'll be able to do that much more effectively. Thank you.
I told you that I have solutions. Centralized infrastructure for election management. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn to the audience. First, thank you all for engaging me in my questions that I threw at you all. Would love to get questions from the audience. I'm going to go with Wefa first and then come to Desiree.
Thank you so much to the speakers.
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself
absolutely.
before you...
Hi, everybody. My name is Wefa Ben Hassin. I'm currently at a Midyar network. In a previous lifetime, I worked in Tunisia and on a lot of these questions. And one of the papers I wrote with a couple of other people was on constitutional courts in Tunisia and the importance of forming them in this in this view of electoral infrastructure and rule of law infrastructure that really supports elections and actually transpiring in a transparent way in the before, during, and after. And this question keeps coming up again and again, and I heard multiple speakers, many of you mentioned this. With regards to Senegal, for example, there was a vote in parliament that postponed the elections until December. Then there was a constitutional council that actually overturned that decision and said, no, we have to have elections in February, and they had them, and the elections were successful. And so I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts, in fact, as how you think initiatives that help integrate and really strengthen rule of law, how can these initiatives be supported and strengthened? And it's a challenge, especially when I think there is no political willingness to actually enshrine these institutions that really are really not very sexy, but in fact are very, very important to actually ensure democratic transitions and rule of law and electoral integrity. So really curious to hear your thoughts, and thank you so much for this absolutely riveting conversation. Thanks.
Should we take a couple and then? Dan, Desiree, I saw your hand first, and then who's Kate behind?
Thank you. I'm Desiree, Francophone Africa Director of One Campaign based in Dakar, Senegal. And thank you for this debate. I like your proposal. If we happen to have centralized electoral system regionally in Africa, like next period, you see there will be a transition of power of at least half of the current head of state in Africa, I bet you. But my intervention is more a contribution. Oge, you asked a question when you were speaking to see if the current framework around the African Union is fit for purpose to take us through transformation. And you don't have the answer. I just want to contribute in that. The current policy and frameworks of the African Union are part of the most progressive within existing international intergovernmental organizations. The real problem is basically people who are behind those frameworks, those institutions. The AU will be as good as member state representatives are, basically. If imagine a scenario where you have a set of countries like Senegal, Botswana, South Africa, Ghana populate the African Union, we will have a different debate. We have a different situation so far. So basically, it's about who are behind, and I'm hopeful that as we move on, you have more and more of really democratic countries, and then the EU will change as we go. Just to finish, I think there are a few proposals in the previous discussion. For example, one of the important things that need to happen within the AU architecture is a certain level of supranationality. That will be very, very important to move things ahead. Currently, you need a consensus to be able to take any decision forward or even to implement it. In a supranationality context, the AU Commission, which is the engine, will be able to drive things beside whatever member state want. That will be actually like a very good situation. This also goes with the Pan-African Parliament, which today is just a room that registered some idea or issue recommendation that nobody actually read. If you have a legislative body which law or provisions are implementable in the countries, you have a different scenario. So basically, my response is we need to have a certain supranationality to be able to take forward and implement some decision. And that will also help us to have an accountability mechanism to see who are those who are not implementing the agreed decisions. And something needs to happen so that decisions are not sleeping in the shelf. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to take Dennis, and then I'm going to do the second round with Kate and Mwadi. Dennis, ask a question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I like your suggestions, but in Uganda we already know the results for 2026. Museveni is going to get 62%. His opponent is going to get 30%. So it doesn't matter what you do, they're going to turn off the internet, they'll turn off the electricity, and they announce the results. There's this will to retain power. It doesn't matter if you have the courts, they have abused the courts. It doesn't matter if you have a centralized system. We know who sits on the AU, and they're all part of the same clique. So for me, my challenge is that what's the responsibility of the Western world? Where we go to DC here and advocate as citizens, but we're facing off against lobbyists who are paid 30 grand a month. Do you know why African governments come and spend 30 grand here on K Street? Because they know where the power centers are. The Western countries sustain these dictatorships. They sustain them militarily by giving them loans. So for me, my question is, how can the Western world, I'll say step away, I don't want to say step away, but I feel they stand in the way of democracy in Africa. When we go and say Museveni is killing people on the streets, they say, oh, but he fought HIV. He did an excellent job in fighting HIV and AIDS in 1980s. He's a remarkable leader. Oh, look how many refugees he's taking. 1 million, that's remarkable. Look what he's doing in Somalia. He's putting boots on the ground, saving the United States from sending their Marines to Somalia. So you have those geopolitical issues. You have national interests that we have to encounter. So it's hard for me to even say that we can find solutions when we know there's this big juggernaut you're facing. We know we go to the State Department many times, we sit with our desk officers, we say, what can you do to help? You know, we see the reports. If you go to the State Department report, they have human rights violations for all these leaders. It's in their reports. They know everything that's going on, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the United States, but we still see these same problems over and over again. So for me, my question is that what's the role, what's the responsibility of the Western world? Yes, we fought colonialism, we're taught we're independent, but we're still dependent on the Western world. They call the shots, in my opinion. And there's strong history of the Western world supporting dictatorships. The history is there. So how do we combat...
Dennis, let's wrap this up so we can get back.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry for the presentation. But how do we combat this juggernaut? That's really the question, because I feel we are facing off against a very strong, powerful, Western world to liberate Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take those three, and Joe, I'll start with you and then walk rightward.
Right. Big questions there. In terms of the rule of law, I think that's a critical piece, because the judiciary is a critical player in, especially when it comes to election adjudication. Usually their decisions can be very powerful in many ways, and I think, as you gave the case of whether it was Malawi or Senegal recently, it does provide a lot of confidence in people's feeling that they can make a change, and I think it helps to mobilize citizens in favor of some of those institutions. So some of the things to think about is, how do we create a system that allows for the protection of the judiciary from especially external political influence? Because that's one thing I've got. The second thing is, even within the judiciary itself, sometimes there are elements internally that can actually influence. And so when you're thinking about the independence of the judiciary, you need to think both in terms of the political influence from external forces, but also the internal forces that can sometimes impact how they operate. But I think it's a critical institution that needs protection, and I hope that we'll continue to build some kinds of protections, especially for judicial officers in the country and the judges who make some of these critical political decisions. Of course, one of the findings we have in our data does show, judicial independence is one of the critical drivers of people's commitment to democratic governance. So those are the three key things: corruption, elections, and the judiciary. Now, the independence of the judiciary and how they operate. In terms of your issue, yes, I do know that the international community has a role to play, and it can actually damage citizens' commitment to democracy in many ways, because corruption is one of the issues that people struggle with on the continent. And if the international community, for the sake of geopolitical expediency, if you turn a blind eye to corruption or you protect a dictator just because it is expedient from the global power competition, then all that we are doing is damaging people's commitment to democracy. Because a corrupt government setting in place citizens, that is the thing that drives citizens' commitment to them. One, satisfaction is already very low. commitment to democracy is still high. If we are not careful and we continue to uphold corrupt governments in place, all it will do is gradually eat away people's commitment to democracy. And we'll get to a point where even getting citizens to have that enthusiasm and hunger for democracy may no longer be there. And so I do agree with your point. To what extent does the Western world or the development world, the developed world, contribute to citizens' disengagement from democratic governance? I think we need to be careful about that. I don't have the answers for that, but as you rightly point out, that is something we need to continue to emphasize. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe on the Constitutional Court question, I think there are ways to connect lawyers' unions and Constitutional Court judges and others who are involved in the design of these institutions. And developing that norm and standard makes a ton of sense. And it will work incredibly well when there is political will to make it work, or where there's political will to tolerate it, so that it tips the balance when things are very complicated. But I would caution that if there isn't political will to make it work, it becomes entirely captured and can just as easily be a tool or a way to continue to hold power. And so I think this is where we face a challenge, where we're trying to talk about approaches across 55 countries, or even across the 8 that have faced coups, when the contexts are incredibly different in terms of political systems, in terms of space for civic and other actors. Maybe just on the finance side, because I think it touches a point here. I wanted to reflect on the country that had a coup on a coup, and then followed by a coup and a war, which is Sudan. And in the moment where there was an opening for a civilian dispensation, the international community failed to provide timely and politically relevant assistance so that civilian government could make the hard decisions it had to make and deliver on citizens' expectations and hopes for democracy. And I don't know that I have the answer. That's easy to say in a soundbite, but the reality of how do you identify, release funding, make it contingent enough that it still puts pressure on those who want to keep holding on to power, it's not straightforward. But there was a test, there was a moment, and we failed on that. And I think the responsibility is squarely on the hands of the military and the RSF for where the country is today. But we missed a moment where there were Democrats who were ready to drive forward, and where people had gone to the streets who had struggled, and we weren't able to collectively provide that cover.
Thanks, Kehinde. And I guess on the question about the rule of law, while not necessarily a direct answer to the question, but I think Senegal, for one, basically provides a case study of why we invest in strengthening democratic institutions. What we saw happen there in Senegal with the courts, the constitutional courts, these are all institutions that are homegrown. These are institutions, Senegal is a country that has never experienced a coup before. And so at the end of the day, these institutions were able to work to uphold the right decision at the end of the day. So Senegal provides an excellent case study of why we should invest in long-term, why there should be long-term investment in strengthening democratic institutions. Desiree, to the point about the African Union, thank you so much for your response. I was told when I came up here that Desiree is the expert on AU, so thank you so much for the response there. And to the last question, definitely don't have a response for that, but I think this is where, again, soul searching comes on the part of African governments and the AU and regional economic bodies. At the end of the day, the hard decisions that have to be made about Africa has to be made by Africans and has to be made by African institutions. Every country engages based on their own interest. The US will engage based on its interest in... do? What did I do? I'm like, it's the AU. I'm like, every country engages based on their own interests. So at the end of the day, I believe that being able to resolve and address some of the gaps that you identified, Africans will have to be at the forefront of it. I think for me, if one positive, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we can see, or we hope to see with the AU's inclusion as part of the G20, is that perhaps it might force the member states to come together, speak together collectively on certain issues. So.
I would basically footnote most of the responses. On the constitutional question, we know exactly what's needed, a degree of institutional insulation, at least for the Constitutional Court, from political influence. However, how you make that happen, and in Senegal, I think we should be careful because the case study is not only about the formal institutions, but the informal institutions who helped negotiate this transition process as well. And to what extent to the bridges between the formal and the informal institutions actually contribute to consolidating democracy? It's a key question that we need to ask. About the external influences, I think it's important to raise the issue of the dotted line of subsidiarity and complementarity between the UN and the AU, and the explicit subsidiarity between the AU and the regional economic communities, right? Because those are different spaces within which issues like good offices actually play a role. So we might need to also interrogate the extent to which good offices have lately not been as effective as they needed to be in supporting civil society organizations or societies actually take the mantle of democracy in places where you had sedimented regimes. The second observation is more of a question, actually. If the Sudanese could rise up, why not Uganda, right? If we had Egypt rise up against Mubarak, why not Cameroon? So in fact, these are all case specific, right? And at times, we need to acknowledge our own intra-societal weaknesses that do not allow us, in fact, to be able to form that internal contract that then builds into momentum against oppressive governments. AU question, I think it's important. The AU deserves support just as much as the Rex in thinking through the reforms that would make them more effective, while cognizant of the context within which they're working. And you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's necessary to think through ways in which not just civil society on the continent can get to a better understanding of what the AU is and what the AU does. Because you'd be surprised the extent to which expectations are absolutely dissonant from not just the realities, but the limited powers that the AU has to act. And in that process, we talk about lack of credibility of the AU and the Rex in the eyes of populations, but a lot of the time, there needs to be a mutual engagement as well across those fronts. So I'd leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you. And in the interest of getting more audience questions, I'm going to actually pause your closing remarks if you all allow me to get some audience to talk some more. But I'm going to ask that we keep the storytelling brief and make them questions, please. Kate and then Wadi.
Hi, thank you so much, Kate Alexander from Madre. I want to return to the question of Sudan because I think it raises an interesting question around the limitations of requesting U.S. engagement when the U.S. hasn't learned from or is willing to acknowledge harmful past engagement, let alone a just policy to prevent those harms from recurring. I'm curious when it comes to Sudan if there's an opportunity here for the U.S. to learn about how to support transformative social movements in moments of transition and what recommendations you would have for both the international community and the AU in playing a role in maybe mitigating the relationship between actors like the US and governments in moments of transition.
Thanks, Kate. And Wadi.
Hi, I'm Wadi Muchanga from Madre. I wanted to comment on the role of France in Francophone West Africa because there have been sort of, conversations with regards to the prevalence of coups, and the gentleman here talked just for a minute about the role of Western governments in perpetuating some of the oppression that we're seeing today. And I think one of the clear examples of that is the role of France post-colonial period, which is deeply entrenched in its former colonies and is very much part of the reason that the young people have risen up. And so I'm asking if there's any analysis about that from our panelists.
Thank you. I'll take one question back there.
Thank you very much. Omogo from IGAD. Just a quick a question that has been bothering me since we started the panel, and I picked it from the 5 or so issues that Fonteh you raised about why coups do happen. But I'm also thinking about, I don't know what your reflection would be on what seems to be an emerging popular leaders, or maybe over-promising leaders, because progressively we are seeing these emerging leaders that are more or less promising you heaven. And I think the informed population quickly realizes that those promises are not deliverable. And then quickly you start realizing now a bit of anxiety between the people against the leader that was really promising maybe heaven on earth. So I don't know what your reflection would be, because I think it is something that seems to be emerging, especially in some sections of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give Moya the last question.
Thank you, Kehinde. Moya Nyandi with Open Society Foundations. To start off, I am a strong believer in democracy, but
I love that qualifier. Where does this go?
Yes. I wanted to hear from the panelists what their thoughts are. I think in an earlier panel we heard from Yaki that Africa adopted security models that are not necessarily tailored to the challenges that we have, like hook, line, and sinker in terms of armies, yet we don't necessarily need them. And this, around democracy, people have sort of like said the same thing in terms of Africa. Are we not being naive in thinking that we can take the same trajectory in terms of building towards democracy, given that older countries built their democracy without the question of social media and AI, artificial intelligence? I think we heard of Malawi not being able to defend its passport system from a cyber threat. You have corporations that have greater GDPs than a lot of African countries. We're hearing of malign actors influencing, and the US has also been accused of, picking and choosing leaders and so forth. So this is the environment that Africa has to build its democracy upon in comparison to older countries. Are we not being naive in thinking that we can achieve the same thing despite these challenges that we have?
Thank you. Those are all pretty varied questions. I'm going to have Oge and Susan, if you can take the question on the recommendations for U.S. in light of Sudan, as well as the democracy in today's age question. Joe and Fonteh, have you take the one on the role of France, as well as the overpromising leaders. So, Susan, do you want to start? Please.
Delighted to. On Sudan, I would commend some research and publications that were done by some of my colleagues who were involved in supporting some of the movements prior to the revolution, the work that started around corruption and transparency, and then reflected on how there was external engagement with those movements in the period leading into the Constitutional Declaration and beyond. I think it's an incredibly important and complex question set, and I think this space to reflect on Sudan is really needed. I also think that it is a country that is facing a complete catastrophe. And in this moment, all of the attention to be focused on stopping the war, ensuring that there is humanitarian access to those who desperately need it. To me, that is the center of the conversation, and where we need diplomats, civil society, Americans pushing to avert the very worst that is already taking place in that country. Moy, on the question of democracy, in some of our programming, we can't have conversations about democracy. We can't have conversations about good governance. These are in countries impacted by coups. We make a decision. We aren't forcing that. Why would we define what the topic of the conversation is? People can talk about social cohesion. People can talk about their expectations of responsible governance and accountable governance. And so if it goes back to how does the US approach, yes, the US articulates values in its foreign policy, and hopefully it stands for those. But if it sits and insists on a word that can't be touched and that people don't feel safe talking about, then I think we're actually undermining those who have the potential to define a pathway forward. So I would agree. I think there's a lot of space and discussion that's needed to define those pathways, and then how partners engage on it.
Thanks. On Sudan, just to add that, I would probably add on a few recent publications from the Wilson Center that actually seek to try to answer the question on how we learn from lessons past and effectively engage citizen voices in the ongoing discussions now to end the war in the country. So I would recommend some of those policy briefs for you. Now, on the question on democracy, like you, Moya, and I'm sure almost everyone else in this room, we're strong advocates for democracy. I want to believe that everyone here in this room is an advocate for democracy. But I think that sometimes we often get so stuck on the term. And being stuck on the term and the way we talk about it has actually also given room to some on the continent who will say, oh, democracy, why are they trying to bring Western democracy to us? But at the end of the day, being able to have representative government, being able to have service delivery, effective service delivery, that's good governance. That's what it is. So I think being able to frame the conversation that way, and we see the framing in those discussions too as well, when citizens talk about it, they just want better lives. They want their governments to be able to represent them. They want to see effective representative governance. So it's important that we don't get too stuck on that term, and also realizing too as well that I too agree with you that the trajectory for democratic development or the road towards consolidation of democracy would be different on the continent, because the challenges that we face today are different. Every country will go through its different, a different pathway towards democratic consolidation. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. And I think we have to be those in the room who are in democracy strengthening organizations. I try to stay away from the term democracy promotion. We're strengthening institutions that already exist. That those who work in these organizations will take that in mind, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And you know, I think sometimes, and this might be controversial for some, when I think about West Africa and people talk about democracy backsliding in West Africa. And I have to question sometimes, and I say, is it really backsliding, or are people taking a different approach? We see citizens fighting back to authoritarian governments. We see what just happened in Senegal. So things are a little different. So based on our definition, how do we define democracy backsliding? So this gives us an opportunity to even interrogate this further. So yes, The pathways will be different. We have to understand that the challenges that we face on the continent today, every country will have a different, will follow a different path towards democratic consolidation. So there isn't one size that fits all. And yeah.
Thank you. Joe and Fonteh, if you briefly address the role of France and then over-promising leaders.
Right. In terms of analysis, what our data has shown is, the influence of France has actually tainted the image of the West in general. So when you talk about people's attitudes towards France and their attraction to China, the attraction to the Chinese or the China model in terms of development is much stronger in the Francophone region. And we think that is because of the role of France. It's more seen as this is a Western example and we would rather go the China way. So the analysis does show that there's that shift towards China as opposed to the West. Populist leaders, well, I think that is also one of the reasons we're seeing this, the celebration of militaries on the streets, because they are the most trusted, I should say. Our data show the military is the most trusted democratic institution on the continent, for sure. And wherever you go, there's no country where the military is not at the top in terms of trust. Parliaments are down there, and the military is always at the top. And so the trust in the discipline of the military, there's a sense of a disciplined institution. That is what citizens want. Can we have a disciplined institution that actually oversees the governance of the country? And sometimes you may see those kinds of reactions. So we make a distinction between military intervention and military rule. They are not the same. So people may want intervention, but they don't want the military rule. And so that's not a distinction to make. But the final point on democracy, I do think, talk of democracy, there are different components to think about. Accountability, responsiveness, the institutions. We ask about all of these, and people's commitments to those institutions is very strong. And so it's not just the word democracy, but it's the institutions that actually anchor this democratic governance. And I think on the African continent, when people say Africa needs a different democracy, I don't think there's anything like a different democracy. Democracy has always been the West form of government, for sure, but it is what people really want, that they can hold their people, their governments accountable, and that they are responsive to their needs. And I think that's not something that anybody should want,
So Joe has spoken to sort of what the data says from the citizens. We look more at the actions of the transitional authorities who came in through coups and not by any means elected, therefore with questionable legitimacy and not very accountable equally to the population, right? And what we see is the transfer of dependencies. So yes, you could blame France for the dependent relationships which fostered underdevelopment. But there's no clear indication that the choices of new partners is actually driving towards an emancipatory agenda. The second is we cannot see a shift in responding to the structural challenges. I'll take one simple case in point. There was a point at which some governments in the Sahel accused France of putting a moratorium on engaging through dialogue with terrorist groups. Since the military came to power, how many dialogues have we seen with terrorist groups to deliver the kind of negotiated solutions to the violent extremist crisis? The third is the question of delivery of public services. I mean, that doesn't change as well. So, in fact, what is the pathway? What is the vision that's driving this grasp for power by the this central-based military elite? It's a key question. And beyond France being an enemy, there is equally ECOWAS, which occasionally is an enemy, and almost everyone else. So there's a way in which the narrative that's structured is one which basically raises external demons to whip up a pseudo-patriotism, and that prolongs a transitional government. And in some countries, we are seeing going to their 4th and 5th years. The second, and that ties in to the overpromising. The challenge we find is not in the promises that are made, it's in the information that undergirds these promises, which more often than not are not very accurate. Not just in the interpretation of previous luminaries who led the country, but also in the articulation of what the real dynamics are. So I think we need to be careful when we interpret those. And of course, it's just a matter of time before the promises come due, the checks come due. And that would certainly create, if we don't kind of learn lessons from previous transitions that inform the way in which we could engage with these new transitional actors, what would happen when the checks come to be paid is that, or to be cashed, is that we would move into another cycle of instability. So it's a postponement that we need to engage with. Thank you.
Thank you. Rather than attempt a summary, we're between you guys and the reception, so I'm going to wrap this up for you all to make sure that can happen. But I do want to thank the panel. This has been, for me, a very insightful conversation, so I really appreciate all the things that you've brought in and the various back and forth that we've had, whether or not they yeah, it's been fun. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And as we conclude, I do hope that these conversations continue. I think today was a very long day for several of you. Thank you to all of you who stayed from 9 a.m. and are still here. And those of you who came later as well, thank you for being part of this. These conversations are important. We say that Africa matters, not just because we think it matters, but because it has to be part of the conversation. And so the reason we do these kinds of summits is because we want to make sure that U.S. government, African Union, all these institutions are having these conversations, and these folks, all of you here, are the reasons why that needs to continue, and it's these voices that we need to be entering into the conversation, so thank you. I want to make a specific thank you to the folks who helped make this happen, so the organizers, the ISS, USIP, HU, and OSF, who've helped make this happen today, thank you all. But specifically, I want to thank the tech team who is back there, who've been there the whole day, thank you all. Please. From USIP, Aya and Belay, thank you so much. Please stand so people can see who you are. From HU, Sabiha, Ayan, Ayla, Annie, and Abby, who's left the room, please stand so you can be recognized. Yeah. And from ISS, Judy is not here, but thank you to Judy who was here. And OSF, Moya, thank you for all of the work that you did to help us make this happen. Yes. And last but not least, this is our second year of doing this. This was Maria Kisumbi's idea 2 years ago. And this is something that we're doing for the second year. So thank you, Maria, for yes. Thank you all, and enjoy the reception.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.